Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's June 24th, 2020, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we explore animal culture with author Carl Safina and whale researcher Hal Whitehead. It was once widely believed that us humans were the only creatures on Earth capable of creating culture, and that's still a pretty prevalent viewpoint. Google the definition of culture, for instance, and you're told that it's the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement. Merriam-Webster also defines culture as an exclusive endeavor of Homo sapiens, specifically the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. But a secondary definition offered by Merriam-Webster has it as the integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior that depends upon the capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. The fact that this is too narrow a definition of culture is implicit in this very definition, because even while it explicitly centers human experience by ultimately defining culture more broadly as something produced through the capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations, we can finally acknowledge that animals are also creators of culture. Carl Safina examines the capacity of several animal species for social learning and transmitting knowledge across generations in his new book, Becoming Wild: How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. Human researchers figure prominently, but the main characters in Safina's book are sperm whales, scarlet macaws, and chimpanzees. Safina appears on the Manga Bay Newscast today to explain how each of these species are equipped to live in the world they live in as much by what they learn from other individuals in their social groups as they are by their genetic inheritance. In the book, Carl Safina calls Hal Whitehead the pioneering sperm whale researcher who has studied social learning in whales and dolphins for decades. Whitehead, a professor at Canada's Dalhousie University, was one of the first scientists to examine the complex social lives of sperm whales and the distinctive calls known as codas that they use to establish their group and personal identities. He appears on the podcast today to play us some recordings of sperm whale codas and tell us about sperm whale culture and social learning.
They have this really tight communal life together. They're nomads, so they're traveling over large areas of ocean, thousands of kilometers, but they do this together. The family group moves together through the ocean, and as it does so, they're feeding together, they babysit each other's young, they suckle each other's young, and if they're attacked, say by killer whales, they defend each other communally. They form a tight group and work together to keep the killer whales away.
The study of animal cultures is new enough that it has yet to really permeate the collective human consciousness. Hence, most people, when they hear the word culture, still probably think only of how different people around the world eat, dress, dance, and make music and art. So when we talk about animal culture, what exactly are we talking about? According to Carl Safina,
when people think about culture, of course, we immediately think of human culture because we're humans, and we wonder then why other animals don't do things like, have music festivals and dance contests and things like that. Although in a way, other animals do have a lot of dance contests. But the thing is not to look at our culture and ask what other animals have culture like us. It's to ask what is culture like for other animals. And there are many other animals that I would say do not have culture and many that do. Culture fundamentally is actually exactly the same thing for humans and other animals, but it takes very different forms. So what culture is, it's the habits, the behaviors, and even the attractions that you learn socially and that can be passed along socially. In other words, it's not things you get purely instinctively. It's not things that you have an instinctive feel for and you work out on your own, like a hunting skill. It's things that you get from your social group, which also can involve hunting skills. There are, in fact, many animals that learn to hunt by hunting with their elders or actually being taught to hunt by their mother and things like that. So fundamentally, culture is the same thing, but it takes very different forms among the very different animals. And what it's for, I would say, is fundamentally the exact same thing. Culture answers the question of how do we live here where we live? And a corollary of that, or a consequence of that, is that when we live a certain way in a certain place, it means that we are different than how others live, either among us or in a different place. And that means that culture makes individuals form groups. It creates a group identity, something that has previously been thought to be purely a human thing. And the groups then tend to avoid other groups, which has enormous consequences socially, ecologically, and even evolutionarily, and enormous consequences for conservation work if the conservation work does not appreciate that there are different cultures, not just all individuals are equal and you can just throw them here and there, trying to reintroduce them without understanding that it's largely culture that lets them survive.
One of the most important points Safina makes in the book is that while we have tended to divide life on Earth into 3 levels of diversity, there is a 4th dimension we're not considering adequately: the differences in modes of living and life strategies brought about by culture.
It actually affects the way we're looking at life, and it affects the questions that we are missing. I was going to say the questions we're asking, but actually the questions that we're missing. So we think of biological diversity as occurring on 3 levels. This is the usual way that it's explained. What is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the diversity of all life on Earth. It occurs in 3 levels. The genetic diversity within a species, within the human species, some people have black hair, some people have blonde hair, some people have brown hair, those kinds of things within a species. The diversity among species, so within things like, the canid family, let's say, you have wolves and coyotes and foxes and other canids. So the diversity within species, the diversity among species, and you have, of course, diversity from mammals to birds to invertebrates, all of that phylogenetic diversity, and habitat diversity. You have rainforests, you have coral reefs. All of that is, the basic idea is that it's genetic diversity. It completely overlooks the existence of culture. And culture is a different kind of thing that evolves. And it's a different way that individuals become capacitated for survival. So just for instance, let's say that you want to reintroduce bighorn sheep to some place in the Rockies where they've been wiped out, extirpated, hunted out, or whatever. You say, okay, well, the habitat is still good enough for bighorn sheep. We'll get some bighorn sheep from over here and we'll put them up here in the Rockies. We consider them the same species, and we're just going to reintroduce this species. Well, the problem may be that area is at 7,000 feet elevation, and in the wintertime it's too brutal, and they need to go down to a winter range. But when you just open the crates and the animals run out, they have no idea where they are. They don't know where the winter range is. They don't know where the food is. They don't know where the water is. They don't know anything. They're like animals that have just been abandoned. It's like abandoning a dog beside a road someplace. And in fact, when all of the individuals are gone and animals are simply moved in, if they have culture, like many have a migration route culture along the lines I'm describing, the mortality is incredibly high when they're first reintroduced. For a bird called the thick-billed parrot that was reintroduced into areas in the southwest U.S., they took adult parrots that they had in captivity in a breeding program, and they simply brought them and opened the cages. They all died. Every one of them died, because parrots have a lot of culture. They understand first of all, they understand what food is in a place. They understand where the food is. They need to know what predators are dangerous in a place, or what places are dangerous to go. And they learn that from the tremendous amount of socializing they do, and from at first following their parents around and then joining in these social groups. So if you don't understand that, you're going to cause a lot of death and mortality in the course of trying to do conservation. If you understand it, your conservation attempts will be much more successful.
One of the species Safina examines closely in Becoming Wild is the sperm whale, But it was actually killer whales who first impressed on him the importance of culture to the lives of some wild animals.
The first time that this occurred to me was that if you look at any science paper about orcas, killer whales, they're considered to be one worldwide species. And yet, what I was reading about them when this first occurred to me, which is a long time ago now, it's probably more than 20 years ago, was that there are orcas in the Pacific Northwest that eat only salmon and others that eat only mammals like seals. And they not only never socialize, but they actively avoid one another. Then looking deeper into that, there are even groups of them that eat only fish that are family groups that form pods. Several of the pods form a community, but the two adjacent communities avoid each other. Now, if you look at them genetically, you see that the fish-eating ones and the marine mammal-eating ones have not interbred for more than 100,000 years. And the definition of species, the most accepted definition of species, is individuals that freely can interbreed if they meet in the wild. So what was preventing them from interbreeding was strictly their culture. They had a different culture that was based on their hunting. Well, it's a different hunting culture, I guess is the best way to put it. You need to hunt fish differently than you need to hunt mammals. With fish, you want to be in a big noisy group. You want to be using your sonar a lot. You want to scare the fish so that they clump together, and that makes it easier to catch them in a big group. If you're hunting mammals, you want to be extremely stealthy. You want to deploy in very small groups, maybe 3 instead of 20, and basically be completely silent. You use as little sonar as you can possibly get away with to avoid being heard. So the two hunting cultures are not compatible. You cannot have fish eaters and mammal eaters mingling around trying to forage. They would mess each other all up. So the groups not only avoided each other, but that avoidance set them off on different evolutionary trajectories that has caused them to avoid breeding together. Now, usually the dogma that I was taught in school about how different species can evolve is that a group from a species, some subgroup, needs to be physically cut off from the rest of the species in order for them to evolve along a different trajectory and be subject to different evolutionary pressures that give some behaviors or some physical attributes some advantage. But here we have animals that are choosing to avoid each other, and that is a culturally driven evolutionary trajectory. So, that's a radical departure from the dogma that I was taught when I was a graduate student. And I always suspected that there was probably a lot more of that kind of thing. And in the course of writing the book, among other astonishing things that I learned about what culture is and who has it and what its purpose actually is, how it actually functions, the range of species that have a cultural component to their evolution and diversification into different species is very surprising to me. And I believe has been essentially completely overlooked by almost all evolutionary biologists.
So why did you choose the 3 species, sperm whales, scarlet macaws, and chimpanzees, that you focus on in Becoming Wild?
Well, I first asked what species are best known as having culture, and then you have to say, well, which are best studied so that you have the richest information. Which of those might I visit with the researchers for some extended period of time? And then among those candidates, which becomes at that point kind of a small pool, fewer than 10 species, I would say, are well studied as cultural beings and are being studied in a place where I would be able to visit for an extended period. So that becomes a smaller group. And then I just wanted a range. I didn't want, it could have been 3 mammals in East Africa. I didn't want to do something that seemed like each representative was too similar. So one from under the sea, one from on the ground, and one in the air, I guess is how I looked at it. I was very, very intrigued by macaws because of something I had seen the first time I saw wild macaws in Peru, which is that I've never seen any other birds, and I used to study birds for a living. I've never seen any other birds where if a flock flies over, you can clearly see the pairs within the flock and clearly see that they understand who is their companion in the flock. But with macaws, it's very obvious. You see 12 of them fly across a river, it's 6 pairs of 2, almost 100% of the time. I was very intrigued by that. So even though macaws, in a way, they didn't make the first cut because they're not known as being cultural and they're not really studied as cultural. But from the behavior that I observed, it was obvious that they knew who they were. And from how rich their behavior is when they are in captivity, even as poor as captivity usually is for them, you see that they have a tremendous range of behavioral capacity. And I just, my hunch was I felt really sure that if I looked at them from that standpoint with people who knew them well, I would be able to see their cultural attributes. And in fact, it worked out a lot better than I even hoped it would.
What's really interesting about how Safina structured the book is that he looks at how each of those animals' cultures are predicated on achieving something that is also recognizably important to human culture. When it comes to scarlet macaws, he looks at how perceptions of beauty inform their culture. And he also asks why it is that what scarlet macaws have evolved to find beautiful, humans also find beautiful.
The decorative beauties in the living world, things like outlandish coloring, like the scarlet macaws have, is beauty that is created by choice. It's through many, many generations of mates choosing mates, largely based on looks, which humans, of course, do. That's why, all these dating apps and things like that, a photograph is a very important thing. When you first meet somebody, a first impression is visual. And physical beauty is very important in mating, and these physical beauties have been chosen over an incredibly long amount of time. Now, with the macaws specifically, an interesting thing is there are dozens of parrots in the New World. Except for the macaws, almost all of them are green. They're camouflaged. They're camouflaged because they're small enough to be eaten by various species of hawks and falcons. The macaws got very big, and they're big enough that they don't have to worry too much about too many hawks or other kinds of predators. Sort of escaped a lot of predation danger by sheer size. And then they exploded with color. How did they explode with color? Because they look beautiful to one another and they're choosing mates partly or largely based on this look. It's a selection. The reason that in many other birds, the males are very colorful and the females are very camouflaged is the females choose males based on looks. So this is life choosing what it prefers. And a very weird thing about this is that what counts as beautiful has a strange universality to it, so that the beauty in a macaw should not necessarily mean anything to us or our sense of aesthetics, but yet it does. And I think that the weirdest thing along these lines in nature is that humans see flowers and the scent of flowers, the look and the scent of flowers, as very beautiful and very attractive, and yet we don't do anything with flowers. Flowers are for pollinators. The reason a flower exists is to attract a pollinator. That's why it looks the way it does and why it smells the way it does and why it's shaped the way it's shaped. None of that is of any practical consequence to humans, and yet there's this almost mystical sort of universality to our perception of beauty. I suspect that the world looks beautiful to the other animals as well, and that the most beautiful parts of the world are the parts that are their habitat, just like the most beautiful things for humans are the things that are human habitat. If you simply look at real estate prices, they reflect what is good human habitat. It's a nice place with trees and a view of the water and basically open ground where you can't have hiding predators. This is the habitat we evolved in as animals that went upright on the open savannas, and this is the habitat that we still have to pay the most money to be near. So, and that's not an accident. There are deep reasons for all of these things. So, what is perceived as beautiful has a long history to it, and I think the most amazing thing is this sort of strange universality that it has. And then a deeper question is, a flower can be appreciated by a pollinator to a practical end for the flower, because the pollinator comes, the flower gets pollinated, and the plant can create seeds and can procreate. So there's a practical outcome to that. But what about the things we see as beautiful that are not capable of any kind of benefit to being appreciated? A sunset, white clouds in a blue sky, the sound of wind in the treetops. These things, a starry night, these things are things that our human mind has a capacity to perceive as very beautiful. And it makes life worth living to have beauty in the world. Imagine if there was no beauty in the world and all you needed to do was work for food, or work for food and try to avoid being eaten, and that's all there was to life. It really would hardly be worth living if there were no rewards to it. And I think that our mind's ability to create the perception of beauty. Beauty is not a physical property of anything. It's a perception of something. Beauty happens only inside a mind. And I think that the reason our minds have the capacity to perceive beauty is so that living in the world feels worthwhile. I think in a way you could almost say that beauty is why we stay alive. And there are many kinds of beauties. There are physical beauties. There are emotional beauties. There's the beauty of being with someone that you love, or with a child or something like that. There are many kinds of beauties, but it's the beauty that's in the world that our mind is capable of perceiving and giving us this tremendous sense of pleasure. That's the result of the perception of beauty, is a sense of pleasure that makes life worth the time and effort it takes.
Safina also writes about how chimpanzees keep the peace through their culture.
Chimps live in communities, and the communities are usually several dozen chimps, and sometimes over 100. And they all have some of them are very, very familiar with one another, and others are very peripheral within the community. But they all have some way of understanding who's in their community and who is not. And that's important because the adjacent communities are hostile to one another, sometimes lethally hostile to one another. Now, within a chimpanzee community, chimpanzees are male-dominated. There's a lot of male ambition, and the most dominant individual is a male, and the rank or the status of being most dominant individual is always won violently. There's always a contest and a fight for it. So if there's all this melodrama to living in a chimpanzee community, the question is, why do all of the chimps that are not going to be the most dominant individual, some of whom will suffer beatings or just live a life of low status, never get mating opportunities, why do they put up with it? Why don't they just say, screw this, I'm not going to hang around these guys, I'm just going to go off over here? Well, one thing about it is that there are advantages to being in a community. The community defends a territory. territory has the food resources and the water resources. So in a way that's very similar to humans, you're kind of stuck in the community you're in. It's not that easy to just leave and be, a person without a country. It's very hard for a human to live that way, even though there are a lot of downsides to the country or often the community that you're stuck living in. And the same in a way is true for chimpanzees. So if you're in a group, conflict is inevitable, but resolving conflict is something you need to do skillfully. And the chimpanzee culture, among things like tool making and things that people are more familiar with, it requires them to be able to patch up their problems with each other and get on with things and get along, even though another problem down the road is inevitable. So they have ways of reconciling. They have ways of understanding that they are reconciling. Sometimes some act as intermediaries and things like that. So, with all of these things, that you start to peel away a first layer and you realize that under the layer is another layer that has more layers under it. And there's no end to how incredibly interesting it is and to how enriching it is to realize, truly, I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but how truly incredible life in the world is. And you start to get some sense of how much time all this has taken to get to be the way that it is. You start to feel a little bit for the first time what the phrase tens of millions of years actually means.
And of course, Safina also writes about sperm whale culture, which he looks at through the lens of family in his book.
What it was about their culture, the sperm whales' culture, is basically that Hal Whitehead had studied them for long enough to understand that they have culture and the basis of their culture. And then his protege, Shane Guerrero, who works in the waters off Dominica in the Caribbean, was kind enough to allow me to join them for a few weeks. Sperm whales have a social organization that's very much like elephants. They live in female-led families. At adolescence, the males leave, and those females, the elder female, maybe her sisters, their daughters, and their young children, they stay together. Those females travel thousands of miles in the ocean, and over the span of decades, they will always be together. That's very, very intentional. It's not an accident. The ocean is a big place. The visibility is very, very limited. If you're going to stay together, you have to work at that, and they do all the time. They understand what group they're in. They understand what family they're from. They announce themselves as a member of a family, as an individual, who they are. They say, basically, I'm here. And everybody understands who is saying that. And by these patterns of clicks called codas, they understand, and other whales understand, which family they're announcing that they belong to and which clan those families are in. And clans, within a clan, families can socialize, but families of other clans do not socialize. In other words, clans do not mix. Families within a clan mix. Families of different clans do not mix. They don't socialize. And they do things ecologically differently. They travel differently. They hunt differently. And that's a cultural thing, and that's why the ones that do it the same way socialize, and the ones that do, basically do their lives differently don't mix. They avoid each other. Why they do it this way is an interesting question, and it has an ecological basis. Basically, they have a babysitting culture. None of the other big whales do this. The other large whales go on a long migration to a birthing area. They give birth in an area where there's no food, but because there's no food, they're relatively safe from predators there. And then the young one will follow the mother and will learn the migration route that way. So that's the way that the culture of migration routes and where the food is learned in the other large whales. But the sperm whales do it entirely differently. They live and give birth where the food is, but the catch is that the food is 2,000 or 3,000 feet down, and the babies cannot go there. Only the adults go there. It takes them about 50 minutes out of every hour to travel down to where the food is, to hunt, to travel back up, to breathe and rest, and then to do it all over again. The little babies cannot do that, and they're completely helpless at the surface if killer whales show up. So the sperm whales have a babysitting culture. They live in a family group where everybody knows each other, and several of them are related as sisters or mothers and daughters. And they make sure that someone is always with the 1 or 2 or maybe 3 babies in the group when their mothers are down hunting. A sister or an aunt will babysit for them. And that's basically the rationale for why their culture is the way it is. But that is the culture that they have, and it's amazing that any human being figured this out, because it's very, very, very subtle, and detangling the patterns in those clicks it's incredibly painstaking.
That's why Safina says that what Hal Whitehead and Shane Garrow and a couple other people in the world have done to understand sperm whales is mind-boggling. Here's how Hal Whitehead himself describes his research interests.
I studied the social systems of whales, and I've become interested in questions that are a bit broader than that, so that include the social systems of other animals and culture, which is related to social systems because it's the information that's passed socially from individual to individual. So it's based on the social system and how that works for whales and how that works for other animals. And then what are the implications of all this are for evolution, for ecology, for conservation, even for ethics a little bit.
And as for how he came to research sperm whales in particular,
I got into the whale business because I loved sailing, and I met some whale scientists who said, you can collect information for us. And I found that was really enjoyable, and I became really intrigued by the whales. I liked sailing far from shore, so it made sense to start trying to study animals who live far from shore. And so way back in the early 80s, I got the opportunity to try to study sperm whales from my sailing boat. And that became sort of a large part of my life since then. So I spend quite a bit of time at sea with the whales, trying to work out their lives. And sperm whales have particularly grabbed me, both because they're truly extraordinary, weird animals. I mean, they're extremes in a whole range of ways. And as an evolutionary biologist, how all these extremes fit together is of interest. Why did this sperm whale end up the way it is? And what are the implications of that for what it is as an individual, a creature, a species, a social group, and what it means for ecology and conservation and so on. They're truly, they're both extremely cryptic. Someone described them as surfacers rather than divers. They spend most of their time deep underwater and just come up for a little bit to get air, which is something they need as a mammal. And so they've got this weird, largely unknown life way beneath the surface. But they come up and they at the surface, they display their social world, and that's really important to them. And that's something that resonates, I think, more easily with us, because like us, their buddies are really important to them, perhaps even more important than our buddies are for us. And they reaffirm their social bonds by using sounds and by touching and by kissing and by just being together. And this social world is vital for them.
I asked Whitehead to tell us a bit more about what we need to know about sperm whales' life cycles and social structures in order to understand their culture.
The basic element of sperm whale society is what we call the social unit, but is really pretty much a family group. And it's adult females and they're young. So the females, their babies, the younger whales, the teenagers. And each female stays in her social unit for her whole life, in most cases. So she stays with her mom and her other female relatives, and they have this really tight communal life together. They're nomads, so they're traveling over large areas of ocean, thousands of kilometers, but they do this together. The family group moves together through the ocean. And as it does so, they're feeding together, they're looking after the young ones together. So as they make deep dives to feed well beneath the surface, they generally leave their babies at the surface. The babies can't dive for as long as their mothers, who are down for 40 minutes at a time. And they babysit each other's young. They suckle each other's young. And if they're attacked, say by killer whales, they defend each other communally. They form a tight group and work together to keep the killer whales away. So it's a very communal life for these female sperm whales. They reproduce very slowly. So a female sperm whale may start having her own babies at about age 12, and then has one every 4 or 5 years until she's in her 40s, and then it pretty much ends, and she may live another 30 years. So it's not too dissimilar to our lives, but the family groups are in many ways tighter, and the reproductive rate, the rate at which they can produce babies, is slower. The males lead quite different lives. They, at about age, 10 to 12, leave their mother and their family unit and start moving towards colder waters. So the family units are in the tropics or near the tropics, but the males, as they grow, they move towards the Arctic and Antarctic. So I'm speaking to you now off Nova Scotia, and here off Nova Scotia, we find only male sperm whales. And these males are not all that old. They're probably late teens, early 20s mostly. But then if you move further north, go to Labrador, to Greenland, the males get bigger and bigger and older, and also more solitary. So the males, soon after they've left their mother, are still pretty social. They've been living in a very social world, and they continue that and have a social life with other males. But as they get older, they become less so, more solitary, and much bigger. So a big adult male sperm whale is 3 times the mass of a female sperm whale.
Whitehead mentioned that sounds are important to sperm whales for reaffirming their social bonds. The most important sounds in this regard are what are known as codas.
Yeah, so the codas, we think of whale song as being complex and beautiful, and it is. If you listen to the song of a humpback whale or even the song of a bowhead whale, it's a pretty extraordinary and sometimes beautiful set of vocalizations. Sperm whales don't sound so exciting on the surface because it's just a pattern of clicks. So the front quarter in the case of females to third in the case of males of a sperm whale is the biggest nose on Earth, and scientists have pondered well, even the whalers back in the 19th century pondered what was this about? This huge nose filled with this oil which lit the lamps of the civilized world at the end of the 19th century. Well, we now know that this huge nose is a sonar system. It makes very loud clicks, which it broadcasts into the ocean. And these clicks are what it uses to find its food, primarily. But then, when the whales are in their other behavioral mode, when they're up at the surface and being social and reaffirming their social bonds, they also use these clicks, but they use them in a different way. Instead of just going click, 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 which is their foraging mode, when they're socializing, they'll make these patterns of clicks, clickety click, 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 or click, 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 click. And they will interleave them. They will, so one will make one of these codas, another one will, and then they'll put them on top of each other, kind of like a duet. So they all definitely communicate in other ways, but the codas are quite likely one of the most important, perhaps the most important way in which they can communicate. And they're a way which we find it easier to get our brains around their world than many others, because we can listen to them easily and try and make sense of them. And for us, they seem quite simple. They seem quite like Morse code. But then as you look into it more, they're just fascinating. There's a different repertoire of codas for each clan. The clans have these patterns of codas, or sometimes identity codas, which is their coda, which they make. So there's the clan we've studied a lot in the Caribbean who do the 1+1+3 coda, click, 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 click. And they, a lot of the time they do this, but then they will also use it to communicate with each other. They will interleave them, they will overlap them, and so on. So the codas have been a wonderful window into their world. It's very hard to see what they're doing underwater, but it's much easier to hear it. And so we've learned a lot from the codas.
We've got 2 recordings of codas for you to listen to today.
Yeah, these are recordings from the Galapagos Islands, and I think they were made about 5 years ago. And they're fairly typical of codas, but unlike some recordings have just too many codas to make it easy to hear what's going on. Sometimes the whales are further away; they don't sound so good. So these are quite good recordings, but they're typical. One of the clips has one whale making codas. The other one has 2 whales making codas, and you can hear them interleaving their codas, where one makes a coda, where 2 makes a coda, where 1 makes a coda, where 2 makes a coda, and then they put them on top of each other. They make the next coda together.
Okay, here's a solo coda. And here's an example of the interweaving of codas. Whitehead says that recordings like these have become really key to his research.
We record the codas, and then we extract their pattern of the codas. And at the moment, that's done manually by students, spending a lot of time looking at the sound on a screen and marking where each click is, and then inputting that into the next stage of the analysis. But we're just beginning to work with computer scientists who are figuring out ways to first extract the clicks from the acoustic recording without us having to do anything, and second, to then define what are codas and what are not codas, and third, once you've got that, to organize the codas. Well, we've got our own schemes for organizing, for finding different types of codas and looking at their variation. And there's one other very neat thing about the clicks of sperm whales, which we can find very helpful, and that's that I mentioned that the clicks are made by this enormous nose, the front part of the sperm whale. And if you look carefully at one of these clicks, it's not just a single click. It's actually made up of several pulses, a loud one, and then a less loud one, and sometimes a third, and so on. So pulse, 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 pulse. And if you measure the time differences between these pulses, it tells you the size of their nose, right? So each sperm whale click contains an indicator of the size of the sperm whale's nose that made it. And because sperm whales naturally have different size noses, and these are pretty closely related to the actual size of the whale itself, that gives us a whole bunch more information. So, for instance, if you take if we take one of our well-known social units, which will have about, eight members in it, they're all going to be different sizes, or nearly all, and so they will have different time delays between the pulses in their clicks. And so we can thereby tell who made which coda and roughly how long they are. And so that gives us another whole insight into what's going on.
Whitehead says that as recently as 10 to 15 years ago, it was still believed that humans were the only species with a culture sufficiently complex enough to affect genetic evolution. So how accepted is the existence of complex animal cultures today?
I think it's become increasingly accepted. So the initial discoveries about animal culture were birdsong. And for some reason, that kind of slipped under the carpet. And I guess one of them is that the people doing this work on birdsong did it very thoroughly. And with birds, you can do clear experiments. You can bring them in the lab and see what they learn from each other. So that was always there, but kind of ignored. And then the primatologists, the people studying monkeys and apes, got into the picture. The earliest studies on monkeys were in the 50s, and then the chimpanzee work started with Jane Goodall and some of her colleagues. And that's when things got controversial, because I think there were several things happening there. First, there was a feeling that this work wasn't experimental, unlike the bird work where they could actually do designed experiments. Initially, people weren't doing experiments with apes and monkeys. Later, they have, using animals in captivity, and occasionally, in very clever experiments, animals in the wild. But also, the primates are so much closer to us, and there was this hypothesis out there that promulgated, especially by anthropologists, that the real difference between humans and the rest of the world was that we had culture and they didn't. And so this, hit that axiom of their work right hard where it hurt most. So the early people studying, especially chimpanzee culture, had a pretty tough time of it. And when my colleagues and I started bringing in the ideas of whale culture about 20 years ago, we also got pretty hard, but we benefited a little bit from the work that the primatologists had done. And but now, we're finding culture in all kinds of places. We're finding that bumblebees can learn from each other how to do complex tasks and pass it on. So there's a form of culture in a bumblebee. And I think in the concept of culture as socially learned behavior is well accepted by zoologists. Now, other disciplines use different definitions of culture. So, for instance, some anthropologists will say culture is a human activity. Well, we can't really argue with that. If it's a human activity, then obviously no other animal has it. But that's not a very interesting, area of dispute. It's just a matter of definition. Some psychologists look at the social learning process itself, how one kind of behavior is learned by one animal from being with or watching or whatever another animal. And for a long time, they've distinguished two forms of social learning. Imitation being what you do exactly what the other animal does, and teaching, where the other animal does stuff to try and help your learning. It tries to make you learn better. And they have said, well, those are the key elements, and those are what makes human culture. And we don't see imitation or teaching in other animals. Anyway, that's fallen by the wayside too. We find meerkats teach, killer whales teach, even in some ways ants teach. And as for imitation, well, there's good evidence now that a range of animals imitate pretty damn closely what they see other animals doing. So things are improving, but I still, when I talk to my colleagues, find it there's a little bit of resistance and amazement when you say, well, look, culture is another form of inheritance. It's a form of inheritance like genetic inheritance because it changes the way animals are, but it moves differently from genetic inheritance. Genetic inheritance goes from parents to offspring. Cultural inheritance can also go from parents to offspring, but it can move in other ways too, from teachers to their students, from peers to their peers, from influencers to all kinds of people on the internet and so on.
As we learn more about animal cultures and how many species actually have complex cultures and social learning capabilities, what needs to happen to sufficiently factor these learnings into conservation strategies?
Well, it can help in a number of ways, and it's important. And I think the on-the-ground people working in conservation have been recognizing this for some time. In a number of cases, with a number of different animals, it's been recognized that if you take one of the most dire conservation situations where animals have been wiped out of an area, they've been extirpated, and you want to bring that species back to that area. Two of the most common things you can do then are reintroduction, where you take animals that have been in captivity, maybe in zoos, and bring them back to the wild in that place, or translocation, where you bring animals from another location in the wild and put them in this place where you want to reintroduce the population. Now, in a whole range of animals, from condors to prairie dogs to Arabian oryx, it's been quite long recognized that if you put naive animals in with no knowledge of the place, and they don't have any access to individuals who have knowledge of the place or the circumstances, they do poorly, and the reintroduction or translocation may fail. All the animals may die. However, if you have in that place to live with them animals who are experienced, who know things about how to survive, maybe in the case of reintroduction in the wild generally, or in the case of translocation in that place in the wild, the new animals do very much better. So this is an important part of it. So one uses the social learning you either carefully keep the animals, the last few animals that belong in that area, and allow them to be the mentors for the new animals, or you use humans to pretend that they are other members of the species so that they can provide mentors for these new animals, or these are the kinds of ways you can make that kind of work much more successful. Another case where conservation and culture become very important to each other is when we're looking at conserving species in the wild. And what we're trying to do here is to, increase or preserve biodiversity, the range of different things that life is and does out in the wild. A fair bit of that diversity for some groups of animals, including the whales, but also animals like primates and elephants and birds, is cultural. So the diversity of behavior in the wild is determined a lot by the cultural history of the animals out there. And the diversity is not only important for its own sake. I mean, we try to preserve human cultural diversity. We try and protect these endangered languages or these archaeological settings, because that is part of our cultural diversity. It's also, as is recognized with things like the preservation of indigenous ways of life, potentially useful to us as we are threatening the world. So, for instance, if you go back to my sperm whales, if you look at the +1 and regular clans of sperm whales off the Galapagos, we looked at what happened when El Nino strikes the area. So El Nino is an oceanographic phenomenon where the waters get a lot warmer than they normally do. And this happens every few years off the Galapagos. And it's really bad news for pretty much everything in the ocean, including sperm whales. But we looked at the feeding success of the two different clans. And in the normal cool years, when things are pretty good, the regular clan, those are the ones who wiggled around and go click, 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 did better than the +1 clan. But in the El Nino years, when life was really tough, then the waters are warmer, and it was the other way around. So the +1 clan, even though it wasn't doing as well as it normally did, only suffered a relatively small reduction in its feeding rate compared with the regular clan. So as we make changes to our world and things like El Nino begin to mimic the way the ocean's going to become in the future, then the diversity of behavior that the sperm whales have, and that diversity is cultural, becomes important. It will help them survive what's happening to their world, to our world.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a nonprofit news organization, so just $1 or more per month will really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level also get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the Manga Bay Newscast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. If you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay, or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.